We're in episode 2 of the English Civil War series by Kings and Generals. Today we're going to be looking at the Battle of Edgehill. Now, I want to quickly say the link to this video is in the description down below. I always put it there. It's always the first. And before I get started, I want to say if you enjoy my videos, my commentary, etc., feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and help my small but humble channel grow. With that said, and without any further ado, let's get to it. Let's watch the Battle of Edgehill by Kings and Generals.
Throughout the latter part of his personal rule,
So the 1600s are often called the century of absolutism. Monarchs all over Europe began enjoying absolute power over their realms.
opposition began to mount increasingly against King Charles I. However, this opposition could not be channeled into any meaningful change due to the irregular and infrequent intervals in which Parliament convened. Nevertheless, this state of affairs would soon change due to growing unrest to the north in Scotland, where the meddling of one Archbishop Laud was about to trigger a war. Scotland's decentralized and
The Reformation made its way into Scotland in 1560. The kingdom split from the Catholic Church, embracing Calvinism and Presbyterianism. No.
radically Protestant church, known as the Presbyterian Church, had deeply ingrained roots in the country's lowlands and parts of the Highlands. The Scots held on to their native faith lovingly, so when Charles and his administration tried to impose the Anglican Book of Common Prayer on them by royal decree, England's northern neighbour began to implode. Nationalist sentiment was stoked among all the classes, all the way from leading Scottish nobles down to the servant girls, one of whom
On Sunday 23rd July 1637 in St. Giles's Cathedral in Edinburgh, a local street seller woman named Jenny Geddes threw her stool straight at the minister's head. She cried, "Deli colic, the wame o ye false thief, dower ye say mass in my dare." I think that's supposed to mean dare. Dare ye say mass in my lug or flug? Meaning, okay, thank God. Devil, cause you severe pain and distension of your abdomen, false thief, dare you say the mass in my ear. Huh.
Victoriously threw a stool at the minister in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh when he attempted to read from the Anglican book. An organised response came on February 29, 1638, when Scottish lords signed the National Covenant, a pledge to uphold the native Scottish religion at all costs. This covenant pledged loyalty to the king, but on the condition that the Presbyterian Church was maintained in its unmolested form. This covenant circled around Scotland and gained rapturous support on all fronts, with its adherents becoming known as Covenanters. Over the next year, attempts at a negotiated solution failed, and war became inevitable. As a result, both sides began to raise their armies, the highly motivated Scots more quickly than the English, many of whom were actually sympathetic to the Scottish cause. Critically, this war footing began to push Charles's finances to the breaking point.
Oh my goodness. So, more ways to get money. I was wondering, because everything seemed connected. You know, Ireland, Scotland, England, and I was wondering last video, okay, how does it split? That perfectly sums it up. Thank you, Kings and Generals.
To further compound matters, many of his aristocratic financiers were Catholic. The First Bishops' War of 1639 was short and inconclusive, ending with the pacification of Berwick, which both sides realized would not put an end to the conflict. So, both the Scots and the English began preparing for its resumption. However, Charles's war chest had run dry, and with all his sources of finance dried up, he was forced on April 13th to summon what would become known as the Short Parliament, the first in 11 years. After just 3 weeks of subsequent stalemate and frustration on both sides, the king dissolved Parliament again on May 5, 1640. Charles then immediately resumed collection of the hated ship money in order to fund his war. The Second Bishops' War of 1640 was a complete disaster for the king. A Scottish army of 20,000 Covenanters, led by the highly competent Earl of Leven, managed to outmaneuver the English, and not long after defeated them at the Battle of Newburn. Following what was the first Scottish victory on English soil since 1388, Leven occupied northeastern England. As a note, the Earl of Leven, also known as Alexander Leslie, had spent the previous decade fighting in the 30 Years' War in the service of Sweden's Gustavus Adolphus. We've previously covered his contribution to the Siege of Stralsund. To end this disastrous conflict, Charles signed the Treaty of Ripon, the terms of which required that the king pay the Scots £850 per day to maintain their occupation. Now burdened by this new financial drain, in addition to his own army, Charles was once again forced to call a parliament. Holding its first session on November 3, 1640, this would become known as the Long Parliament, because it would not be formally dissolved until March 1660. This time, Parliament was almost totally united against the king, and its more radical Puritan elements, led by the Earl of Warwick, began to dominate affairs. His radical allies tried and executed the Earl of Strafford, Charles's chief minister, began lengthy legal proceedings against Archbishop Laud, and secured other unprecedented concessions from the crown. All of these demands and more were set out in the Grand Remonstrance, a document of grievances and conditions, the most crucial of which would have deprived the king of many traditionally royal rights and privileges. It didn't seem that Charles was going to accept any further restriction of his power anyway.
Yeah, again, Charles ain't kind of guy. I feel like I said it last video, and I feel like his biggest character flaw is he's not so willing to compromise, at least like majorly. And I feel like that's probably what did him in the long run. Like, he's almost like you can't reason with him, because he really does come across as my way or the highway. So, yeah, I feel like Charles, and it's gotten to the point where that and also just this financial, like, blunders have now just united. Like, again, he mentioned all of Parliament is now more united against him. He's almost his own worst enemy in a weird way, you know? And creating problems for himself that, in hindsight, could have been avoided if he had just taken a different approach, you know?
But an external factor now intervened and made everything that much worse. In October of 1641, a Catholic revolt led by Philip O'Neill of Kinnaird erupted in Ireland. Thousands of Protestants were already dead, and many more were refugees. It was clear that an army would be necessary to quell the Irish. But under whose authority could the army be raised? Parliament no longer trusted the king with military force, fearing that he would use the army against them, while the king would not accept Parliament's control because of the same reason.
Oh my gosh.
For some reason, perhaps because Charles had uncovered evidence that his enemies in Parliament had been conspiring with the Covenanters, Charles marched to the House of Commons with 400 soldiers on January 5, 1642. There, he attempted to arrest 5 MPs, John Pym, John Hampden, Arthur Hazelrig, Denzil Halls, and William Strode, the ostensible ringleaders of this imagined Covenanter conspiracy.
This is wild.
When this attempt embarrassingly failed, the royal family quickly left London and went to Windsor Castle, fearing that the Parliament-supporting London mobs would be riled into a fury against them. From this point forward, King Charles and his opponents at Westminster edged slowly closer to civil war, with each side unwilling to blink, and both sides hoping that the other would do so first. Charles was able to convince many of his English and Welsh subjects that he stood for the defence of their traditional constitution and Elizabethan church doctrine, while Parliament argued that the king ought to be deprived of his remaining constitutional powers, as it was clear that he could not be trusted to use them. This too attracted many supporters, as did the widespread Puritan desire in Parliament to undertake radical religious reform. In the end, both sides attracted enough support to take the final step towards civil war. By early 1642, Charles had moved his court north to the city of York. Attempting to seize control of the situation in Ireland and assume military authority of their own, Parliament unconstitutionally issued the Militia Ordinance in March 1642, permitting them to raise an army and appoint its commanders. They chose the staunch anti-royalist Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, whose father had been executed after an attempted coup against Elizabeth I. Now requiring an army of his own to counter that of his enemies at Westminster, Charles passed the equally unconstitutional Commission of Array, allowing the king's chosen commissioners, usually local nobles, to levy troops from their own regions for service in the royal army.
Yeah, everyone's reading the Constitution, huh? My goodness.
As the twin armies slowly began to grow, Charles marched from his base at York to the armory city of Hull, arriving outside its gates on April 29th. The city contained a vast amount of arms and ammunition, enough to supply the Royalist army's coming campaign if it became necessary. As it turned out, Charles was out of luck. Hull's governor, Sir John Hotham, had flipped to the parliamentary cause and barred the gates to the king, forcing His Majesty to retreat in humiliation, eventually ending up in Nottingham.
Yeah, Charles taking L's right now. And again, just rejecting a king from your gates is so, like, baller, though.
It was there that on August 22nd, 1642, the king officially raised his royal standard on Castle Hill. In what was thought by many to be an ill omen for the coming clash, a storm blew the banner down the following night. The campaign began slowly. On September 9th, Parliament's appointed commander, Essex, established a headquarters at Northampton, with the aim of intercepting Charles's army with his own, and preventing any royalist march on London. The king, meanwhile, was still in a bit of a shaky situation. With only 5 regiments of foot and 500 cavalry troopers by this time, the king's army needed more men. In order to get them, Charles departed from Nottingham September 13th and marched west through Derby, Uttoxeter, Stafford and Wellington, eventually reaching Shrewsbury on the 20th. This position allowed the Royalists to absorb more units Charles's commissioners had raised in North Wales and Lancashire, swelling his army to a workable size. While this was happening, the Royalist horse, under the experienced command of Prince Rupert, took up position in Bridgnorth, aiming to screen any potential parliamentary attack on the main army. Prince Rupert was the son of Frederick V, Elector of the Palatinate, who had failed to gain the throne of Bohemia in 1618, essentially beginning the 30 Years' War. After being captured by the Holy Roman Empire in a military campaign, Rupert had been freed by the diplomatic maneuvering of his uncle, Charles I. He subsequently came over to England and gratefully joined the English king's army as an extremely competent cavalry commander. Essex,
yeah, I'm loving how much of this is tying into the 30 Years' War, which I'm really happy we covered that series so I know who the heck some of these people are and how they connect to England at the time. That's wild. Small world, eh?
They attempted to prevent a royalist thrust towards London and deter further royalist reinforcements by marching towards Worcester. While the bulk of Parliament's field army was ponderously making its way through the scattered villages of the Midlands, Essex sent 2 cavalry regiments ahead to secure the west bank of the River Severn. However, when around 1,000 parliamentary horsemen ran into a similar number of Rupert's royalist horsemen at Powick Bridge, the former were quickly routed and driven off by the prince's superior tactics. This was the first true engagement of the Civil War, and was, according to parliamentarian Hugh Peters, where England's sorrows began. Buoyed by this initial victory, the now enlarged Royalist army began to move out of Shrewsbury on October 12th, with London as its ultimate objective. Charles would march on the Viper's Nest and end the war here and now. A week later, Essex began his eastward march in pursuit, eventually arriving in the vicinity of Kyneton with the aim of protecting Banbury, while Charles and his army were conducting operations from the nearby town of Edgehill. Because of the two sides' inexperience in war, insufficient scouting had not alerted either side to the presence of the other so close by.
Oh no. Okay, that word caught me, inexperience, so I'm like waiting for both of these guys to completely start blundering. And already that is a blunder, not having good scouting. So I'm expecting a mess now in this battle.
A Royalist Council of War at Edgehill, held on the 22nd, decided that a 4,000-strong brigade would attempt to seize Banbury the next day. By nightfall, the King's army was dispersing into billets around the Wormington Hills, while at the same time, Essex's army finally arrived at Kyneton. While Charles was staying at the home of Sir William Chansey, Prince Rupert rode to Wormleighton, and seemingly by chance, managed to capture a quartermaster's party from Essex's army, which was nearby. I'm
taking note of Rupert. So far, Rupert seems like on Charles's side, perhaps maybe gonna be the most competent. I don't know, I'm keeping my eye on Rupert though. I'm like almost expecting him to be a very prevalent figure so far.
Information from the prisoners, Rupert sent a few mounted scouts to Kyneton, who returned at midnight and confirmed that the entire parliamentary army was right there. By 3 AM on the 23rd of October, Charles was aware that Essex was in the area, and an hour later, exhausted officers began to dispatch orders to their men for a general rendezvous near the Edgehill Heights. At this point, the King's Royalist army was between Essex and London, meaning that it could have marched towards London relatively unopposed. However, Charles and his...
Yeah, definitely, probably could have done that, maybe? Oh, that's actually an interesting thing. If he had done that and gone to London, I wonder if that would have changed anything. Or if London would have been fortified and he would have to essentially, like... I don't know if there were any fortifications in London, or if they would have to eventually turn into a siege, but that's an interesting thing that he could have, but didn't. I'm assuming because he wants to completely crush the parliamentary army, maybe the army of Parliament would have eventually gained wind of his march and would have, like, forced march to meet him. So I kind of agree, probably in the idea that maybe take out the enemy. But then again, who knows? But I could see the reasoning, at least, in maybe take out the parliamentary army in one foul swoop, right? And then go to London, I'd imagine is the mindset that they're going through. I could understand that.
Advisors would not back away from the clash, and decided to do a 180, finally meeting the Roundhead army near Edgehill, 3 miles southeast of Kyneton. By the afternoon of October 23rd, the armies of Parliament and King now faced each other across a section of arable land and meadow just northwest of the main slopes. To all those present on both sides, it seemed as though the decisive battle of the war was at hand. With its battle array formed on the level ground just in front of Radway, Charles I's Royalists arrayed their army in 2 lines of battle, opting to deploy in the Swedish-style checkerboard formation rather than in the Dutch style, which would allow the second-line regiments to form a continuous front if needed. Infantry brigades in the first line, from left to right, were led by Henry Wentworth, Richard Fielding and Charles Gerard, while those to the rear were led by Sir Nicholas Byron and John Bellasis. All appear to have been about the same size, for a total infantry force of just over 9,000 men. Opposite them were Essex's infantry, formed up into 3 large but loosely formed brigades of roughly 4,000 men each for a total of 12,000 foot. The central brigade took up a mainly defensive position behind a small hill, while the 2 on the flanks were slightly in front. Most of the cavalry on both sides of the battlefield was present on Prince Rupert's royalist right wing. He held overall command on this flank, had a unit of 1,000
Wait a minute.
dragoons.
Are these hidden units? I just caught that, but look at from the parliamentary side. Look, this unit's in the woods, and this unit is literally right next to Rupert. So if they're hidden, then they seem hidden to me. Does that mean that the parliamentary army might get one up through a sneak attack from the flanks? And they thought ahead? Huh.
And was opposed by James Ramsay's parliamentary cavalry. Also on this side of the battlefield was a unit of parliamentary dragoon mobile infantry and musketeers hidden to ambush in a nearby hedgerow. On the other flank,
Okay, that tells me already off the bat. I'm starting to think. I usually like to speculate who's gonna win this battle. Maybe Parliament is gonna win this one. Maybe.
Less numerous royalist cavalry under Henry Wilmot faced those commanded by the Duke of Bedford. It's said that King Charles visited every unit of his cavalry and all of his infantry formations in order to review his troops and encourage them for the coming battle. He even wished to ride with his army, but was persuaded to retire to the rear with his small lifeguard cavalry reserve, the majority of which had persuaded the king to let them join Rupert's charge. The first major battle of the English Civil War finally began at 2 p.m. with an artillery duel. Lasting for 1 hour, neither bombardment inflicted heavy losses and served more as a loud prelude to the real battle. While this was going on, dragoons on Rupert's extreme right wing were able to discover and eventually repel.
Holy crap, okay, that caught me off guard. I was like, dude, because for a second there, they were literally like almost behind Rupert. I was like, if he moves, that could easily just jump them from the back. There's still this hidden contingent over here, but getting rid of that one was probably the most dangerous. Again, Rupert's side, I'm keeping my eye on him. I'm wondering if he's gonna be a prevalent figure, because so far he's been making a lot of the big moves so far.
Roundhead ambushes within the hedgerow, providing the main cavalry force with a free run at the enemy. With Essex's army unwilling to move first, fighting began when both of the royalist cavalry wings launched a thunderous head-on charge at their opposition. Using the latest cavalry shock tactics of direct charge imported from the continent by Prince Rupert, the king's horsemen on both flanks swept away Parliament's cavalry, which still used stationary Dutch tactics of firing from saddleback.
Dang. I have to give it to Rupert. Like, so far, mainly because of him, Charles has cavalry superiority. But then again, in terms of infantry, the parliamentary side definitely has the bigger, numerical advantage. So, who knows? I was leaning towards Parliament at the beginning, but I don't know. Rupert has already changed, is kind of making me sway a little bit. I'm not sure how this could end up going.
A unit of parliamentarian troopers even deserted and joined the royalists. With both of Essex's mounted wings swept off the field, it seemed like the time was right for the king's horse to pivot and launch the coup de grace against Parliament's flank and rear. However, due to the indiscipline of its commanders and individual soldiers, who were flushed with the glory of victory, they instead continued chasing the routed enemy. Historians believe that if the royalist cavalry had
they could have easily just hit them from the sides, right, and won this.
halted, regrouped, and charged at this point, the English Civil War could have been put to a decisive end, but it was not to be, and the opportunity was lost. With almost all horsemen now...
That sucks. That sucks so hard. They could have actually easily won right then and there. Oh, that sucks, dude. Now it's just an infantry battle. And again, with Rupert gone, now I'm like, oh. I mean, granted, both of these sides are inexperienced, as he mentioned earlier. So this can just go either way. But Parliament has the higher infantry count, though, so that's an advantage there.
Off the field, both infantry forces filed into a single line of battle and prepared to advance. Musketeers blasted away and softened up the opposing foot, before the pikemen, wielding their 16-foot-long weapons, came into...
I love pikes! The pike, my favorite weapon, happy to see it around, which makes sense, obviously, it's still in use during the 30 Years' War, but my favorite weapon is back. Pike on pike action, baby.
Contact.
But wait a minute. The thing is, I just noticed as well, Parliament still has cavalry units, at least back here in the reserves, right? So, depending on how they use them, or if they come into effect, they could hit hit them from the sides and the flanks if they used it correctly. Or at all. And so far, the artillery doesn't seem to hasn't come into use at all, but...
And engaged in a so-called push of pike, a shoving match, during which the two sides literally pushed each other until one broke. Better equipped parliamentary footmen...
Yeah, very much phalanx-like, right? Like, when the Greek phalanx is fought, and it's essentially more of like a push until one side broke. Never change pike on pike warfare.
Managed to gain a slight advantage, and casualties slowly began to mount on both sides.
Again, like you see the royalist forces sort of going around flanking them, but again, I've noticed that these cavalry units in reserve, I think, could easily, I mean, not easily, but they could potentially just turn the tide of battle if they're used right now.
Now that all of the royalist cavalry had victoriously left the field...
Oh, they created a gap! Oh no.
Two parliamentary reserve cavalry units, under Sir William Balfour and Philip Stapleton, which had previously been hidden behind a small hill, struck the flanks of Byron's unit.
Wow.
After subsequently bursting through the royalist centre, Balfour managed to disable a few of the enemy's artillery pieces. Without knowing it, they had also come extremely close to capturing the king's sons, Charles and his brother James. In the midst of the fighting, the king's royal standard was seized by the parliamentary infantry, but was then recaptured by a royalist cavalry officer. By late afternoon, inexperienced soldiers on both sides were shaken by the experience of battle, and by dusk, Rupert's cavalry returned and stabilized the situation.
Okay, so I have to say, this is all over the place. This is a complete mess. Sides here, like, the royalist forces on the sides have, like, kind of flanked other contingents. You see right here, they're surrounding. And then, in the center, the parliamentary reserve cavalry has broken through. But I feel like they haven't fully utilized their breakthrough. I think it definitely is the inexperience coming into play, but I feel like they could have easily crashed upon the wings and wreaked more havoc before Rupert returned. Again, I guess the key word is inexperience, right? And these commanders that seems to be the big thing about this battle in particular. The commanders, once they get advantages, aren't like fully capitalizing on the advantages that they're getting to kind of win battles, to win the battle. So again, this is such a complete mess. I don't know what the heck is gonna happen. At first I was with Parliament, but now, and then I was kind of swaying towards the Royalist, and now I'm just like, I don't know what the heck's going on anymore.
Neither side had any further stomach for the battle, and both backed off at nightfall. By the time morning came, the Royalists had retreated from the field, and the battle ended as a stalemate. The 1,500 dead soldiers was a small casualty count when compared to the horrors on the continent, primarily due to the terribly cold night which followed the battle at Edgehill, which helped to seal the fate of many injured troops. After the brutal and inconclusive Battle of Edgehill, the Earl of Essex's battered and demoralised parliamentary army retreated north to the safety of Warwick Castle. Meanwhile, jubilant at the news of his army's victory, and urged by his firebrand cavalry commander Prince Rupert, King Charles I ordered a measured advance towards London. He advanced via Banbury, which capitulated on October 26th, then took Oxford.
Yeah, it seems like this battle was inconclusive, even though I feel like there are points where both sides had an opportunity to deliver a killing blow, but both kind of blundered. Again, inexperience, I know, but coming into play. But, still though, at least the aftermath, in terms of how do you say, morale? Charles' side seems to have gotten the win, at least because they're jubilant, and yeah, the parliamentary force kind of is more on the back foot.
The city which would become the Royalist cause's beating heart throughout the First War. While the main armies of both factions thrust and parried each other's blows near England's great capital city, the embers of conflict also burst into flames in the outlying counties. In the north, the Earl of Newcastle, Charles's appointed military governor in the region, assembled a small but disciplined army and faced off against the parliamentarian Lord Fairfax and his prodigious son and second-in-command, Sir Thomas. Throughout the course of 1642, Newcastle gradually gained the upper hand in Yorkshire, pushing the anti-Cavalier forces back to Selby. He enjoyed such success that in December, the Earl even received royal thanks for his service. In the West Country, Royalist and parliamentary forces fought a small-scale war of raids and counter-raids near the Welsh border, a state of affairs that would continue well into 1643. In this theatre too, the king's men gained the upper hand. As the war on the periphery continued, the king's main army resumed its march on London after stopping at Reading to consolidate. However, this delay allowed Essex to overtake his opponent by moving via Northampton, reaching London before the Royalists got there. The armies clashed again on November 11th, when Royalist troops under Rupert caught and badly mauled 2 regiments of parliamentary force near Brentford.
Yeah, Rupert might be the MVP on Charles' side. This dude's kind of carrying hard. And again, that opportunity, right, for London seems to have now blundered, at least in terms of, like, Essex getting there first.
A key staging point on the way to London. Much like they had at Edgehill, the Prince's victorious troops went too far instead of consolidating their position. This time, rather than simply taking Brentford as a prelude to moving on to London, his men looted it. While this plundering was gentle when compared to the ravages of the 30 Years' War on the continent, inhabitants of nearby towns began forming into a citizens' army, prepared to resist further attacks. When the Royalists approached the village of Turnham Green, only a few miles from London, they were opposed by a ragtag army of 24,000 parliamentarians, composed of men from the capital's trained bands, Essex's beaten army, and hastily armed civilians.
Oh, crap.
Against this defensive bulwark, there was nothing Charles's army could do. The Royalist host was already short of supplies, and still depleted in numbers after Edgehill, and moreover, if the apparently imminent Battle of Turnham Green became a true battle, the killing of London's ordinary people, however armed they were, would likely turn the country against its king even more. So, after an incredibly tense standoff lasting almost all day, the Royalist army turned out.
Yeah, man, this seems to be a trend so far in this part, that whatever advantage the Royalists get, they never seem to fully capitalize on it. Again, could have taken probably Brentford, could have won after Rupert's crushing the enemy cavalry, could have won the Battle of Edgehill decisively. Again, whatever advantage they seem to be gaining, they seem to be like kind of not able to fully follow up or capitalize on.
Withdrew at dusk. This was a pivotal moment in the war, for the Royalists had failed to retake the city, and its massive wealth, industry, ports, and strategic value would remain a keystone of parliamentarian power. After this anticlimax, Charles dispersed his army to winter quarters in Oxford and the surrounding towns, where support for the king was most pronounced. Over that winter, the famous university city was transformed into an alternative military capital for the Royalist cause. While the king's army put down roots for the cold season, Essex's still numerically superior force concluded the year by besieging and capturing Reading. After this, with disease and many other issues plaguing both armies, a stalemate set in. Essex wintered in the Thames Valley, where his army was dormant until the campaigning season of the next year. To further protect the capital, civilians began digging earthworks and other defences. By the turn of 1643, it was clear that any chance of a quick Cavalier victory had been snuffed out. On January
Wasted
23rd,
opportunity.
1643, a parliamentarian force under Sir Thomas Fairfax stormed a 1,500-strong Royalist garrison at Leeds under Sir William Savile. After a swift 2-hour battle, the Royalists were defeated, the survivors withdrawing to Wakefield in the evening. The sullen appearance of Leeds's beaten and downtrodden Royalists spooked Wakefield's own garrison, and by nightfall this town too was abandoned. The next day, Fairfax's men occupied Wakefield. With Leeds and Wakefield taken, a line of communications had been opened between Sir Thomas and his father. Sir Thomas would remain at Riding until the end of March, when he was recalled to Selby. Meanwhile,
The parliamentary forces are starting to take way more towns, as things are going much better for them now.
Newcastle and his forces returned to York. Here, his command was faced with two tasks before he could return his attention to Lord Fairfax. First, he sent General James King with a detachment of horse troops to escort an ammunition convoy from Newcastle to York. On February 1st, the convoy was ambushed by a sallying force from the Scarborough garrison, led by the city's parliamentarian governor, Sir Hugh Cholmondeley, at Yarram Bridge. Although Cholmondeley's force held the advantage of good terrain, they were beaten back from the field. Soon after, Cholmondeley would defect, declaring his allegiance to King Charles and transferring much of the East Riding of Yorkshire to Royalist control. The immediate concern for Charles was a lack of military resources, particularly gunpowder and match. His wife, Henrietta Maria, was in the process of ferrying hundreds of barrels of these, other supplies and money to Oxford from the Low Countries. However, until he received these critical munitions, the main Royalist army was unable to undertake any proper offensives. Failure to capture any of the major port towns of the south meant that the Queen's convoy had to dock at the northern coastal town of Britlington, which was under Newcastle's control at the time. For the time being, a wedge of parliamentarian-held territory sat between the king and his much-needed supplies, a fact which made the Yorkshire campaign of 1643 even more vital. While the Queen took residence in York, Newcastle fought the two Fairfaxes for supremacy over Yorkshire's valuable clothing towns. In an early spring campaign, it seemed as though the Royalists were going to maintain their hegemony in the north. Lord Fairfax found himself in a precarious situation at Selby, having little support. With Newcastle's main army at York and the defected Cholmondeley holding much of the East Riding, Fairfax's power now lay solely in the West Riding. Sir Thomas Fairfax was ordered to bring what men he could to join him at Sherburn, as Newcastle's forces were in a good position to intercept them on their way to Leeds. Sir Thomas soon returned from the West Riding, bringing a small force of musketeers and horses, supplemented with a large body of clubmen, local volunteers armed with whatever weapons they could find. Sir Thomas was given the task of creating a diversion for his father's march by engaging the small Royalist garrison at Tadcaster. During the march, his troops passed through the old medieval battlefield of Towton before making their way to Tadcaster's outskirts. The royalist garrison of 3,000 to 4,000 men, seeing Sir Thomas's large host approaching, promptly abandoned the town to the Roundheads. Newcastle had planned to send a large horse contingent to intercept Lord Fairfax's march, but with Tadcaster fallen, he feared his intelligence reports were off, and that rather than advancing to Leeds, Lord Fairfax was actually moving against him at York. Having this train of thought in mind, Newcastle deployed his army in an order of battle on Clifton Moor. The diversion by Sir Thomas's command had played out perfectly.
Dang, man. Smart maneuver there.
Causing the royalists to question their enemy's movements and intentions. However, finding Tadcaster abandoned, Sir Thomas opted to destroy the enemy earthworks in the town, causing much delay, while a sizable contingent of royalists crossed the River Wharfe at Thorpe Arch, just north of Tadcaster, and was advancing rapidly on his position.
Dang, okay, I went over time. Tomorrow we'll be covering the Battle of Tadcaster, so I'll see you guys then.